What's good, YouTube? It's your boy Des Reacts back with another video. Today we're checking out what if World War III broke out between NATO and Russia. This is by the Infographics Show, so it should be a good one. Let me know what you guys think before the video. Who do you guys think would win? Russia, who has the most nukes in the world, or NATO? It should be pretty interesting. Yeah, I mean, without further ado, appreciate all the support and the love on the last videos. Please smash that like button, hit the subscribe button if you guys haven't already, and let's get into it.
It may never happen, but it's the Cold War redux we're all anticipating. In a prospective fight between NATO and Russia, who emerges victorious? Before the war, the group of officials stood silently under a brilliant blue sky as 30 brightly colored flags billowed in the wind. Behind them, a crowd of onlookers under the shade of a white canopy watched the procession unfold. To their left, the courtyard's sunlit field of flags reflected in the domed glass facade of NATO headquarters on the outskirts of Brussels. It's a truly landmark day. The band began playing. A hush fell over the crowd. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Norwegian Secretary General, proudly stood at a small pulpit opposite a barren flagpole, watching with an array of foreign ministers, diplomats, military officials, and heads of state as a uniformed honor guard unfurled and slowly hoisted another flag before them. This one bore an unmistakable dark blue cross against a white field, symbolic of the lakes, sky, and snow that shrouds the country's verdant landscape each and every winter. This is an historic day.
Maybe I should know this, but where is like the NATO's headquarters established? If you guys know, let me know in the comments.
Stoltenberg proudly declares, as news cameras broadcast his speech around the world, "We welcome Finland as the newest member of our alliance. 31 flags flying together as the symbol of our unity and solidarity." Finland's white-haired president Sauli Niinisto takes the pulpit following Stoltenberg's remarks. Humbly reflecting his predecessor's optimism, he assures the crowd of Finland's commitment to the security of all NATO member states, adding that his nation pledges to be a reliable ally that strengthens regional stability. 2,541 kilometers to the east, sunken and sullen in a well-worn leather chair, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin seethes with bitterness, listening passively as Niinisto ends his remarks on the television playing in the corner of his office. A cowering advisor at the
Look how they got his little secretary shaking, boy.
The door flinches as a water glass flies past him, shattering against the wall. "Sir," the man says to his brooding leader, "NATO has started to reinforce the Finnish border." "We expected this would happen," Putin replied coldly. "The West has gone too far. We must strike while the iron is hot." "Yes," his advisor said, pausing. "That may not be possible." Putin looks up slowly from his desk. His advisor pulls out a sheet of paper from a leather-bound folder. "We just received this from Kaliningrad Oblast. The situation is dire. Senior officers of the 11th Army Corps have defected, sir. They refuse to obey your orders. They say it's a suicide mission, that they'll be annihilated. Another Ukraine, or even worse." Putin pounds his fists on the wooden desk, screaming at his browbeaten advisor. "We cannot afford to lose Kaliningrad," he says. "If the Belarusians will not assist us, we will do it ourselves. NATO will not get away with their blatant intervention in Ukraine. Now we will see how united they really are. Send in the Spetsnaz, the First Guards, and any other elite troops we've left. Tell them to take the Suwalki Gap, invade Lithuania, and restore order to Kaliningrad. With NATO and the Poles cut off from the Baltics, we'll see how much the Finns and the rest really want to fight." The advisor nods, backing away into the corridor. Putin's plan.
Oh, okay. So it looks like Finland, if Finland joined NATO, which I don't know if they are or not, assuming they're not based on this, Russia would be trapped basically. You know, they have a country on top, country on the sides, then the sea that's right there. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, that would be a smart plan for the West to do, honestly, to suppress Russia would be Finland joining. But then again, you know, World War III might happen, whatever this, you know, crazy stuff.
Man was a little more than a pipe dream, and he knew it. The First Guards had been all but destroyed in Ukraine, its elite corps replaced by untrained conscripts. What would the Spetsnaz do against overwhelming air power? This contingency was years, even decades old, a Soviet-era scheme. The army was not what it once was. With these thoughts running through his head, he hears Putin yell from down the hallway. "This time, imperialist NATO will get the war they always sought." Later that week, NATO's battalion-sized forward-based multinational deployment in Lithuania is overwhelmed by on-rushing Russian troops, which had for months been stationed in Belarus. They speed across the rural Suwalki Gap, bisecting Kaliningrad and Belarus, seizing crossroads, setting up air defense systems, and briefly sending NATO's tripwire forces into retreat. Back in Belgium, NATO's governing body congregates and triggers Article 5. This is it, one official soberly tells the other. This is the big one we've all been waiting for. We're at war with Russia. Call President Zelensky, tell him we're now in this with him to the very end. We know you're probably...
Bruh, just those words, man. I think Russia would get destroyed, personally. Just from what I'm seeing in Ukraine, Ukraine's holding their own. Obviously, there's foreign fighters, fighting against the Russians, which hasn't been seen, right, since the last war, Afghanistan, right, where you'd have a bunch of insurgents from like Syria, Libya, you name it. Extremists, terrorists coming to fight the allies, right? The US and the UK, whoever was in the war with us. So that's interesting. So what's your guys' take on that? I mean, I feel like Russia would get destroyed if US and the West stepped in.
Probably laughing right about now.
But I know I should just let it play. I'm assuming China, North Korea and stuff is about to get involved in this, so it's about to get good.
War with Russia? You're saying incredulously? The same Russia that can barely make inroads against a country 28 times smaller than itself? A country with 100 million fewer people? The same Russia that has allegedly already suffered 250,000 casualties in a single year of fighting? A figure higher than the entire number of soldiers killed in every war the Soviet Union and Russia has fought in since World War II? Combined? Well, yeah, that Russia. As counterintuitive as it now seems, Russia still poses a grave threat to the Eurasian security and Western values the world over. It may never happen, but Western analysts have contemplated a number of hypothetical scenarios where a series of cascading crises align in just the right way for war to break out between NATO and Russia. These take existing conditions in Ukraine into account, which have undoubtedly altered both the Kremlin and NATO's calculus over the past year. Russia simply does not have the same fighting strength nor the reputation it once had, and Ukraine is blunting the Russian bear at a fraction of what might have cost NATO countries to do so in a World War III scenario. So how could NATO and Russia end up at war? If we know NATO's defensive posture prohibits it from initiating hostilities, what are the pathways to horizontal escalation, that is, expanding the conflict beyond Ukraine's borders, that Russia could conceivably take? The war in Ukraine has left NATO policymakers in a bind. They know they must try to help Ukraine fight effectively without appearing as though NATO is engaging in the war itself. This has resulted in a number of indirect strategies, everything from donating military aid to offering military training in NATO territories, all of which have had a positive effect on the battlefield.
And I don't know if you guys know, but America sent like billions of dollars worth of, aid to Ukraine. Like every now and again, I look on the Facebook or some Instagram would be like, U.S. sends $795 million more dollars to Ukraine and stuff. We're funding it. Like the West is funding it. UK, USA, you name it, guaranteed.
But they also invite scrutiny from Putin and his bitter band of propagandists who portray NATO's actions as tantamount to escalation. Meanwhile, they cleverly ignore the fact that they were the ones to invade in the first place. Rules for thee, but not for me. The most plausible of the escalation scenarios arises from this combustible dynamic: NATO's desire to assist Ukraine and Putin's clear disdain for said actions. The probability of Russia attacking NATO while it's bogged down in the ongoing bloodbath in Ukraine depends in part on how Putin interprets the actions of the United States and its allies. If the past is any guide, we shouldn't put anything past him. The seedlings of the first and arguably most plausible scenario for war between NATO and Russia might already have been planted. That is, in the rapidly unfolding crisis in Ukraine over the past year. The die has already been cast, locking in the US, Russia, and NATO in an escalation spiral that will continue to deteriorate until a state of general war emerges. The signposts for this scenario are already visible. The US and its Western allies.
Do you guys think, I don't know who created NATO, but do you guys think the US created it? Which I'm sure they did. The US, probably UK. I don't know. Let me know.
Imposed tremendous sanctions on Russia after its invasion. Citing the unprovoked nature of the attack, they have committed to supplying Ukraine with much-needed military support. Moscow, until now, has not really responded to NATO's overt assistance in any meaningful way. As more Russian Mobiks are killed with American-made M4s, more aircraft are shot down with British-made Starstreak missiles, and more tank turrets are launched into the stratosphere with Swedish AT-4s, Putin decides that enough is enough. He starts retaliating covertly, approving a sweeping comprehensive cyber attack on NATO's critical infrastructure. Maybe he authorizes the assassination of a key military or political figure. Maybe he sponsors more sabotage missions on the Western support structures fueling Ukraine's war effort. Either way, NATO will incrementally escalate their involvement. Putin then escalates in kind, and before you know it, this tit-for-tat escalatory cycle leads to a clash between NATO and Russian troops, and boom, World War III has begun. It's a vague, casual chain, but it's arguably the most plausible catch-all scenario for escalation to World War III. What about a more direct path? In another scenario, Putin greenlights a direct preemptive kinetic strike on NATO in the belief its forces are poised to attack Russian forces in Ukraine. It's conceivable that Finland's recent accession to the NATO alliance might have something to do with this. In the matter of 1 year, NATO's border with Russia has doubled, adding over 800 miles of densely wooded, difficult-to-patrol tundra. The Baltic.
Oh, so are those new members that joined NATO? They must have just joined them like when this war kicked off.
Sea has come firmly under NATO's protection, with Kaliningrad being the only Russian outpost in an otherwise Western-friendly sea of states. For nearly 3 decades, there was a type of quote-unquote gentleman's agreement in effect that prevented NATO from really bolstering their frontier forces near Russia. Before the war in Ukraine, both Russia and NATO had respected the terms of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act.
Fun fact, 1997, that's the year your boy was born.
Committing both sides to avoid reinforcing or permanently stationing forces on the territories of the former Warsaw Pact states or across Russia's neighboring NATO-aligned countries. This has meant that for years, NATO has only positioned anemic, battalion-sized multinational battle groups in places like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, something they call tripwire forces, that are meant to delay a Russian advancing unit until NATO can flood the battlefield with its more robust response force and very high readiness joint task force. NATO understands that as long as Russia didn't escalate, it wouldn't need to reinforce these frontline units. Of course, Russia broke this gentleman's agreement when it invaded Ukraine. That's why Finland joined NATO in the first place. And that's why NATO now has a clear pathway to bolster its presence in these critical areas by rotating and increasing the capabilities of permanently based multinational units.
Okay, so is Finland part of the NATO then? Like now? Or is this just hypothetical if they join? Like I'm assuming the 800 miles is probably, Finland or something like that. But man, this is crazy. This dude does a really good job with these.
If Moscow perceives this movement of NATO troops as a threat to its security, it might believe that it has little choice but to blunt the damage NATO can inflict by committing to a first strike against NATO's resources, hence our hypothetical opener. The West shouldn't be worried about such an attack though. Moscow's conventional long-range missile supply has been seriously drained in Ukraine, leaving it with far less munitions to initiate, much less support a preemptive strike on crucial NATO targets in Europe. To get more bang for his buck, Putin might simply level up to the next best thing far earlier than anyone expected: non-strategic nuclear weapons, something Russia still has in abundance. It would have massive consequences, but it might be his only chance to level the playing field. He will gamble that the West will not enter into a mushroom-shaped death cycle by retaliating with nuclear force. How could we even get to that point? Well, it's not as far-fetched as you might think. If you've been keeping up with the news, you've seen the Russians commit war crimes almost everywhere they've gone, from Bucha to Irpin and more. The brutality of Russia's campaign through Ukraine has truly opened Western eyes to the savagery of war and the danger of allowing aggressive tyrants to sponsor carnage on this scale. Recently, a video has surfaced showing laughing Russian soldiers gunning down a defiant Ukrainian prisoner in cold blood. In another case, we see a chilling throwback to the preferred attention-grabbing tactic employed by ISIS militants being replicated by the Russians in a video showing a Ukrainian prisoner being beheaded by his Russian captors. It is chilling stuff.
Whoa, I didn't know they was doing all that now. I mean, they broke, that's war crimes, right? So if that's the case, are they allowed to, fire off white phosphorus and stuff into Russia? I mean, that's crazy. Did what the terrorists did, bro. Beheaded Ukrainian soldier, laughing about it. laughing while they're shooting them. Like, man, that's some crazy stuff. War is wild. It's crazy.
And if it continues, public outcry against Russian war crimes might compound until it's created the necessary impression that NATO must intervene to stop the carnage. Such public outrage might be enough to mobilize more direct military action to compel Russia to cease its barbaric and misguided crusade. If Russia can provoke this kind of response from the West, and most importantly, if it feels the West might authorize a NATO-first strike, something that would most likely take the form of a large-scale air attack on vital military targets, then it might just decide to strike first. There's also a good chance that a war arises through some form of miscommunication or misinterpretation of enemy actions. We've already seen a few near misses in the last 12 months. Whether that be wayward UAVs, missiles, or artillery rounds gone awry, it's not inconceivable that a similar event leaves an even bigger collateral footprint that provides just precedent for horizontal escalation.
So I don't know if you guys seen, but like a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, a drone, like a suicide drone, whatever they're called, hit Russia's capital. I mean, do you think that was one of those things he was talking about where it was almost like the breaking point where Russia might use nukes because Putin was in there, right? And it hit the top, but it was like a baby explosion and didn't like go off like everyone thought it would. But it's crazy, man.
Putin and the Kremlin have always been paranoid about NATO's long-range strike capabilities. They're thanking their lucky stars the West hasn't yet equipped Ukraine with their longest-range missiles, the Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS, which can strike up to 300 kilometers away. Fearful of a political decapitation strike launched near its borders, Putin could decide enough is enough and launch a preemptive strike of his own, with the goal of coercing NATO into not intervening further in the conflict.
Which I think... Yeah, I mean, if I was Russia and I was Putin and, the U.S. gave him those bombs, those missiles that could, 300 miles or kilometers, like that's crazy. I mean, that might push him over the edge.
If he did decide to do this, how and where might Putin try to strike to inflict the most damage? The most likely scenario might be something Russia already tried to do: interdict the channels of the Western military assistance to Ukraine. Say, for example, the latest delivery of Western aid, the Bradleys, the Abrams, the Leopards, and the Challengers, ultimately contributes to a successful Ukrainian counterattack akin to those we witnessed last year in Kharkiv and Kherson. Then, say, Poland and Great Britain decide to do what NATO has been debating since the start of the conflict, donating fighter jets to Ukrainian forces in a bid to further turn the tide. If the fighter donations are anything like the debate surrounding Western tanks, in all likelihood, many more will soon follow. There's a possibility that Moscow recognizes its position in Ukraine will deteriorate unless it acts, and the best way to stop the flow of vehicles would be to strike the supply depots, airfields, and railway lines facilitating these deliveries before they can affect the balance of the war any further. Cutting off the flow of weapons and vehicles wouldn't necessarily have to involve deep stocks of precision-guided missiles. We know the Russians don't have as many of these as they'd like. It could be a concerted cyber warfare campaign, covert operation, or an alternative gray zone activity just under the escalatory threshold that gets the job done. According to a RAND report, Russia reportedly undertook such an effort relatively recently. Press accounts suggest that Russian operatives covertly destroyed an arms depot in the Czech Republic in 2014, presumably to prevent the weapons it contained from being shipped to Ukraine.
Oh, shoot. I didn't know that 2014 that happened. I guarantee you it was the Spetsnaz. That's their, super high up special forces in Russia.
Attacking covertly would probably avoid full-scale retaliation from NATO. Putin will fall back on his plausible deniability, while NATO convenes an Article 5 summit and weighs an appropriate response. Just how far NATO's retaliatory strikes would go would depend on the scale and destructiveness of Putin's initial attack. There is a third possible route to war, one in which things get so bad in Russia itself it forces Putin to escalate. Thus far, Putin has proven adept at maintaining his grip on power and stifling anti-government protests that have popped up in response to the invasion of Ukraine. Like it or not, the West has a rich history of sponsoring regime change around the globe.
Okay, so is in Russia, the Russian citizens, are they against the war? Or they have supporters of it? You guys let me know in the comments. And I seen a little while ago, there's a few days ago, there's a civil war going on. One of the Wagner groups, a mercenary fighting group in Russia, that was part of the Russian military basically like turned on them and they started fighting. Is that still happening?
Things get worse for Russia, it's possible that Western strategists identify and seize the opportunity to help local protest and partisan groups consolidate and amplify their voice. Moscow sees threats everywhere. As it always has done, it'll blame the protests on Western intervention, real or imagined. Exacerbated by sharp economic downturns, political instability and chaos erupts throughout the country. Popular unrest grows in scale, essentially destroying the government's ability to control its people. Putin now has two options: stage an internal coup he can easily stifle and blame it on NATO, or strike NATO targets, absorb the retaliatory strikes, and hope they're enough to unify his people against a common enemy once more. NATO versus Russia. They say you can't trust anything you see on the internet these days, but it's getting harder and harder to ignore some of these antiquated weapon sightings surfacing on social media.
Facts.
Recently, images of actual Russian T-54s being pressed into service reveal just how deep the Russians are digging into their Soviet-era stockpiles.
Okay, so those are really old tanks then, right? Like probably 70s, if they're talking Cold War, like late 60s in the 70s.
Things are true antiques, and if they're any indication of the contemporary state of the Russian military, it would be in deep trouble if it ever came into contact with NATO. It's worth reviewing the relative state of each side's military capabilities here. NATO is fortunate, at least far more fortunate than Russia in this hypothetical. Its robust network of military alliances and partnerships throughout Europe mean it would be far from alone in a war against Russia. There is strength in numbers and resolve in collective resilience. The force multipliers you get when you pool the diverse capabilities of military allies is not something Russia could count on. Not that it could capitalize on such a situation even if it could. In fact, Russia can only really count on direct cooperative assistance from Belarus. And amid attempts to not involve the nation in the Ukraine war, Belarusian loyalty to Russia is an especially unproven commodity. While Russia has struggled to coax Belarus into fighting alongside it, NATO's military force now exceeds 6 million personnel, well over 4 times that of Russia. The tip of NATO's spear is much sharper, not to mention its vastly more refined support structure that is categorically
I like those little animations.
superior in almost every way. According to Statista, NATO has about 5 times as many aircraft, 4 times as many armored vehicles, and 3 times as many military ships. Not to mention the backing of the world's biggest defense spender, the US. Its defense budget alone is well over 10 times that of Russia, who spent a paltry $80 billion on defense last year. Russia is in the midst of a new military reform, something
We spent how much?
US. Its defense budget alone is well over 10 times that of Russia, who spent a paltry $80 billion on
$80 billion? Whoa. And we're in peacetime? Yeah, I feel bad for whoever we have conventional warfare with. I mean, that's why we don't have free healthcare right there, right? Like our military. Damn.
defense last year. Russia is in the midst of a new military reform, something its Ministry of Defense announced at the end of 2022. Most see this as little more than a haphazard attempt to patch a sinking ship. They're trying to grow their modern military to the size it was over 2 decades ago, but today there remains a lack of specialists in charge of maintaining military equipment and vehicles, while the military infrastructure inherited from the USSR no longer exists, meaning rebuilding efforts will be slow. Additionally, there were tens of thousands of auxiliary positions like military financial officers and army construction workers, which have also ceased to exist. Russian journalist and military analyst Pavel.
Yes, I don't know if you guys know, like those dudes are crucial. Like the little engineers, construction workers and stuff, you know, those dudes get stuff done. They build like, you know, like outposts and all that. So like the US, we have like the Army Corps of Engineers and stuff that like will go and build dams. They'll go build, you know, whatever they need to build. That like construction's crucial in militaries for sure. I'm shocked that Russia doesn't have them.
Falkenhauer explained the situation well when he said,
And how do you not have like a budget person like in charge of all your money, your defense budget? Whatever that they're talking about. That's crazy.
Nominal size of the armed forces cannot be increased in a realistic and meaningful way. Russia lacks qualified junior officers. There's nobody to command the conscripts they're throwing to the battle. The army of 1.5 million soldiers Russia dreams of is a little more than a bureaucratic fantasy. Still, Russia is trying to restore its depleted forces to the numbers it boasted prior to the invasion of Ukraine. It isn't working. Its armed forces today are lacking in some areas of modern military technology, including drone capability, electronic components, and radar and satellite reconnaissance. Felgenhauer told the media, "Yes, we have weapons, but our reconnaissance capabilities are weaker than our attack capabilities. So we have long-range, sometimes precision-guided weapons, but we don't always know where the target is. But we know all about Russia's material and doctrinal deficiencies. What about its ability to actually embark on what we all fear it might? Invading NATO." Back just a few years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a study by RAND's Arroyo Center analyzed Russia's ability to project and sustain large-scale conventional forces beyond its own immediate neighborhood, based off its performance since the end of the Cold War in Syria and Ukraine. It concluded that its expeditionary capabilities were relatively limited owing to a lack of overseas allies, strategic lift assets, poor maintenance of its logistics lines, and an inability to marshal enough support to wage combined operations at a significant distance from Russia's borders. Things have gotten a lot worse. Factor in the fact that Russia is already poor at training and has been integrating newly mobilized recruits as early as its interventions in Chechnya and Georgia. The reason it scrapped its mobilization army concept and transitioned to a majority volunteer force to begin with, and you're left with a hollowed-out, unsupported force structure that, on its best day, could only carry out rapid intervention and seizure of territory on Russia's border. Well, it tried that in Kyiv and it failed. NATO has the edge in the number of tanks, the edge in infantry fighting and armored vehicles, the edge in MRAPs, the edge in self-propelled and field artillery platforms. You get the point. Whatever Russia has, NATO has more of it. Just about the only area of parity is nuclear capacity. Collectively, NATO possesses just over 6,000 nuclear weapons, virtually the same as Russia. Of these, it has deployed somewhere in the region of 2,400, compared to Russia, which has deployed only 1,500 of its own.
So, is that with the USA combined? Is the USA part of NATO? I feel like it's not, but I definitely know it, backs it, but I'm assuming that doesn't count the USA.
Russia does have the edge in tactical nuclear weapons, almost 2,000 of them to NATO's 500. But if you're going to use a tactical nuke on the battlefield, you might as well scale up to the real thing. The war begins. Western analysts were once confident Russian ground forces could rapidly seize Baltic territory, overwhelm NATO's frontier defenses, and seize the capitals of Estonia and Latvia in something.
By the way, man, I hope you guys are having a great day. Hope you're having a good day. Tell your mama you love them. Dad, you love them. Brothers, sisters. They need to hear that sometimes.
Like 60 hours. Today, estimates for this type of worst-case scenario have come under serious scrutiny. If Russia somehow ever drummed up the means of invading the Baltics, it would retain some advantages. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are relatively small countries with humble military capabilities. And as previously mentioned, NATO only sustains a small forward presence in those countries, about 4 battalions worth of light forces with sparse artillery support, and most importantly, no main battle tanks. These forces would be purely defensive, hoping to inflict damage on Russian columns while buying time for NATO to flood reinforcements and resources forward. Here, NATO suffers a rare comparative disadvantage. Yes, it could rapidly deploy overwhelming air power to support the front lines, but thanks to its Kaliningrad and Belarusian garrisons, much of the Baltics are firmly under protection from Russia's integrated air defense system. NATO would have to rush mobilized mechanized forces, armored brigades, and other rotational units long distances to the front using limited rail throughput, complicated by the fact that European countries speak different languages and have different transportation networks and policy restrictions governing the movement of military forces through their territory. This can extend deployment timelines by days or even weeks. In reality, though, this would frankly be delaying the inevitable. Even if it took months, the US and its Western NATO partners would eventually make their way to the Baltics, albeit probably under fire as they did so. Russia fears Western air power. It will rely on its air defenses to keep NATO fighters, helicopters, and multi-role attack aircraft at bay. Heavy artillery barrages and long-range air-to-surface and cruise missile strikes would feature prominently in the ensuing fight, at least as long as either side's stock remained filled. Nowhere in the rear would be safe. But this is precisely where NATO would shine. It far outclasses Russia in terms of its ability to gather and share intelligence, acquire targets, and destroy them more precisely. Russia has shown its affinity for massive indirect artillery barrages, which serve as more of a psychological tool in a long attritional conflict than a way to generate operational momentum. Eventually, NATO would target and destroy all of Russia's medium and short-range air defenses and establish air superiority. They would prioritize Russia's communications and logistics networks. With those crippled, it would only be a matter of time before its armor, air, and artillery, working with massed multinational formations, sweep Russia from the battlefield and restore order to the Baltics.
And that's something you guys got to think about. Like, the air superiority of the West is just insane. You know what I'm saying? Like, our fighter jets and all that, our bombers, you name it, are second to none, right? Like, Russia definitely have a tough time.
Where does it end? A month into the conflict, and Russia's resources will be straining to the breaking point. The West will show no signs of weakening. Putin will do everything in his power to make a statement, trying to get the West to negotiate a settlement that leaves him with a tangible return on his aggressive investment. NATO's objectives are clear. It will not negotiate with Putin until every inch of its territory is secure. By this point, there will be few options left for beleaguered Russian forces. Cyber attacks, gray zone warfare, and rogue militias terrorize villages and towns across Russia's borders. NATO responds with more shelling, artillery, and precision strikes in kind. Putin has failed to seize the Kaliningrad corridor. He's failed to gain a foothold in the Baltics. NATO has restored Ukrainian sovereignty, launching a lightning counteroffensive into Crimea. In the east, Putin's Air Force and Pacific Fleet, along with their communications arrays, have been mauled by American forces operating out of Japan, Guam, and Alaska. Putin has no...
Dang. See, I forgot about that side of Russia, right? They got Japan, Guam, in the U.S. they got to deal with over there. I mean, we already have forces that are just like waiting, you know, to go into Ukraine if they need to, just waiting in Poland and stuff. But yeah, you kind of forget about that. But it's interesting that they didn't add China into this equation, assuming that China would join the fight. If not, I mean, reasons would probably be like they don't want to get nuked. You know what I mean? Like, they don't want their people to die, right?
No recourse left. His army, navy, and air force are in tatters, having sustained far greater losses than NATO. Kaliningrad capitulates. The borders of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are secured. As Russian troops surrender en masse, Putin sues for peace, is assassinated, or commits suicide, take your pick. We should count our lucky stars that we didn't have to live through the Cold War, when the threat and the stakes of a NATO-Russia confrontation were far higher than they seem today. Yes, the threat of nuclear annihilation remains omnipresent, but Russia's military capabilities have been laid bare in Ukraine, where after over a year of fighting, it has thoroughly revealed itself to be out of its depth against an enemy supported by the West. If the West could throw its full weight into the type of existential conflict Ukraine is fighting today, things would probably be very, very different. Now go check out the aftermath of World War.
Yeah, shoot, man, that's pretty crazy. He did a really good job on this video. Let me know your guys' thoughts. You guys think Russia would win, or based off him, you guys think, you know, the NATO would win? Hope you guys are having a great day. Catch you guys on the next video. Smash that subscribe button, hit that like button. Peace.